And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author, Michael D. Greaney, author of 10 Battles Every Catholic Should Know, published by TAN Books, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. Welcome, Michael, to EWTN's Bookmark. First time we've got to speak. You were on with Father Mitch back at the beginning of the year on his live show. So let's talk about 10 battles every Catholic should know. So you're a military historian. You spent your whole life focused on military things, right?
No.
Okay.
I'm an amateur in what I consider the best sense of the term. I do it because I'm interested in it. Mm-hmm. What I do professionally is I administer retirement plans for clients. And my volunteer work is for the Interfaith Center for Economic and Social Justice in Arlington, Virginia, where I work with Catholic social teaching and its applications using modern financial methods.
Okay. Now, these are 10 battles every Catholic should know. Why are these the battles they should know? Are there not other battles? Did you start out with 20 and ended up with 10? How did you come up with these 10, and why should we care about them?
Well, first of all, the book is mistitled. That was the chief complaint I got from people who liked the book, that said, but this is the wrong title. These are 10 battles everyone should know. Mm-hmm. Okay. And my main reason for selecting them was, one, they were in a theater of operations that most people in the West aren't aware of, Central and Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. I mean, when most people think of the wars, you know, the Crusades and the wars against the Turks and everything, they think of Spain or North Africa.
Right.
And virtually everyone knows about the Reconquista because of El Cid and, you know, Columbus and the expulsion of the Moors and the Jews. But nobody seems to care too much about Central and Eastern Europe, at least until Pope St. John Paul II came in. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden it achieved new prominence. Well, I had gotten interested in it before that. Mm-hmm. And
why? Why were you particularly interested when so many others weren't?
Because it was more pivotal. See, as a CPA, I like to find out why something happened, but then go to the root causes of why. Because in accounting, you can't correct something until you find out why it's happening. You can't just fix the problem, you have to fix the cause of the problem.
Right.
And much of what was happening in Western Europe was the result of what was going on in Central Eastern Europe and in Asia.
And you've got basically a 600-year spread here about from 1071 with Mazakert through, is it Khotin, or how is it pronounced?
I think it's pronounced Khotin.
Khotin, okay.
And it's spelled even more ways than it's pronounced,
okay,
as far as I can tell.
Well, I'll defer to you. 1621. Over that 600-year period, there's one, besides the location, which goes from, like you said, all the way over to Malta, because you're talking about Vienna and into Anatolia, basically. What's the one link that all of these things have in common?
The one link that ties everything together and that I deliberately put into the book was the war against the Ottoman Turks. Mm-hmm. It seemed that they were the most consistent in pressing home their efforts to conquer the world.
Why?
Their entire economy ran on conquest. Mm-hmm. Unlike other, Muslim nations or peoples or areas, they made virtually no effort to develop the area economically. They had to keep expanding in order to survive. Mm-hmm. Like the Moors in Spain.
It's like their own Ponzi scheme, basically.
Yes. That's basically what war for profit is. Mm-hmm. Whereas,
if the army starts to get restless because there's no booty or no loot.
And the economy starts going downhill because there's no infusions.
Right, because we need to be able to acclimate that from outside because we're not producing it internally.
Right. And an empire built on conquest is the shakiest type there is. I mean, the most shaky of all, of course, was Alexander's, which didn't even survive his death by more than a couple of months. But you contrast that with something like the Roman Empire, which lasted in one form or another until 1918, because the Roman idea of empire building was to develop economically and politically and just basically make life better for everyone by turning in the Romans, of course. But
if I was to pick up this book and I saw it as a Catholic book and I pick it up and I say, well, the thread I see is that this all has to do with Islam, okay? But is it because they're Islamic or because they were Turks who, had a bad economy?
A little bit of both, although in extenuation to other Muslims, the Turks were just as nasty to other Muslims as they were to Christians. It was just that they had their own peculiar way of looking at things.
Because most people would look at it now and say, okay, fine, so this is, and Vienna, we hear about Vienna and Lepanto as Catholics sometimes. There's even an organization called the Lepanto Group, basically, and they understand the idea, well, this is where we stopped the Islamic invasion of Europe, okay? And you go through it in the various inferences in the book between the Malta 1 and 2 and Vienna and some of the earlier things that happened. And it's seen mostly from the surface as being, you know, well, it's Islam versus Christianity. But as you point out, it's much more complicated than that. Right?
Yeah, it's always more complicated than that. It's an oversimplification and a truism to say that all wars are economic. But the Turkish expansionism was economic. It had to be.
Now, you, in the introduction here that the publisher put in, I'm not sure what your involvement was in putting that in.
Well, I drafted it, and they fixed it up a
there's
little
the
bit.
quote from you know,
George
Santayana. Everyone's about those who cannot remember the past condemned to repeat it. And the point you make on it is this idea that many people are stuck in what Santayana called the perpetual infancy of failing to know either where they came from or where they're going. And the whole idea of the American culture shows the results of academia's failings. In the summer of 2017, for example, and I think you indicated to me prior to the show, it's worse now, you know, the whole declining interest in history. I hadn't thought about this because it's clear that that's what's going on. I mean, you talk to young people, they have no idea how anything came about. But it's actually hitting museums and places people go and visit. I hadn't thought about that, in fact.
Yeah, I was rather surprised myself because I used to go visit Colonial Williamsburg quite a bit, living in Northern Virginia. And of course, anytime I had relatives visit, they say, oh, we have to visit Colonial Williamsburg. And it seemed pretty crowded to me. But as my life got busier and fewer people came to visit, and I haven't been there for a while, it didn't strike me just that the crowds were falling off. And the historical places, the last time I went to Gettysburg, there weren't that many people. And yet it was prime tourist season.
Right. Right, and Gettysburg, for anybody who hasn't been there, it's a fabulous place to go and visit.
It's
really
also frightening when you consider that Pickett's charge, when you see where it happened, a mile and a half of open ground.
Exactly. Right. You give those men.
I could see why Shelby Foote recounted the anecdote of the Confederate soldier saw a rabbit run away and said, "Run, hell, was I hell, I'd be running too."
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Especially having to climb over a couple of fences on the way across there. But you mentioned the fact that students are saddled today with politically correct interpretation of viewpoints regarding how they're supposed to think. As a result, students know what attitudes and opinions they need in order to achieve popularity, let's say, in modern society. And so what would be that academic impact that would make people have a less interest in history or a jaded interest, let's say, in American or Western culture's history?
Well, what really drove that home to me recently was seeing a woman called Dr. Noriko Arai. She's a Japanese mathematician and robotics expert. And she challenged herself to build a robot that could pass the entrance examinations to Japanese universities. What she discovered was that, much to her surprise, she was able to do it. She concluded in books that unfortunately have not been translated into English that students are not being educated these days. They're being programmed like computers. They will be able to answer certain types of questions accurately, but anything that requires genuine thought or creativity, they're going to fail completely at. Now, understanding history, if the only way you teach it is, just giving lists of names, dates, and major events, that's the kind of question that a programmed computer can answer, but it's boring.
Right.
If you don't tell a story, then, why would anybody want to learn history?
Right. Well, I think what you point out in this book and what you show in the individual stories of the battles is that the battle, in a sense, is this result of all these other things that have happened before, and the following battle is a subsequent reaction to what happened after.
Right, exactly.
And unless you understand that cause and effect, you don't really understand what the battle was really all about.
Right. Most people think that armies and the military are there to go out and kill people and win battles. No. They forget that the perfect military situation is one in which you force the enemy to do what you want to without fighting.
Right, exactly. That soft power kind of thing that can be used with a stick or.
Yeah, I mean, this has been known for thousands of years. It's the whole idea behind Sun Tzu's The Art of War, or even Vegetius's The Four Books of Martial Policy. It's why fight if you don't have to?
Right, exactly. To most Americans, to a lesser extent, Western Europeans, the story of Central and Eastern Europe as well as Asia Minor is completely unknown territory, a sort of tabula rasa or blank spot on the map. What struck me with this is some of this, and I was thinking in terms of what's going on in the world today, sometimes with immigration from other parts of the world, certainly Islamic country immigration, as to see the difference in the reaction between, let's say, the Western part of Europe to that approach being somewhat open, and the Central European being much more closed to that, and realizing there's a really historical reason why that's the case, right?
Yes. It almost bred into them at this point that you say Turk or Muslim, and you will see an immediate reaction. Whereas you talk, there are people in Hungary, for instance, who not too long ago would look with favor even upon the Nazis. They said, oh, the Nazi occupation wasn't anywhere near as bad as when the Turks came through, or even the Russians. They just have this knee-jerk reaction against them.
Right. And you talk about the different battles. So you start with the first one, Manzikert, which obviously I was unfamiliar with, but apparently Bela Lugosi and Dracula were heavily involved in this battle in some fashion or form.
No, that was 400 years later.
Oh, okay. Okay, was that
the real Dracula?
Oh, okay. Vlad the Impaler, who, as you point out, and it is depending on your perspective, was either a good guy or a bad guy or a little bit of both.
Yeah. If you believe fiction, he was evil incarnate. But if you know anything about Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, which is the source of virtually all the screen and book riffs on it, pretty much all he took from the real Dracula was the name. Vlad III of Wallachia, not Transylvania, is regarded as a national hero in Central Europe because of his one-man crusade against the Turks.
Right.
He had been promised aid by the Pope and by the Emperor, but never got it. What aid that was given was used against other European rivals, not against the Turks.
Right.
And even then, Vlad almost won.
Right.
It was like that much.
And in a lot of ways, it seems to be that Vlad's bad reputation came from basically practicing what he learned from the Turks.
Yes. As a captive of the Turks for years, he learned what they feared most by making the logical assumption that if this is what they're doing to others, it's because they fear it more themselves.
Right.
So if he had done what, to his own people, what the propaganda sources against him say he did, he would have killed more people than existed.
Right.
But
sounds like what they claim about the Crusades or the,
of course,
Christendom's attack on burning witches or whatever phony stories
are out there. I think some of the figures given for a burning witch were that if they had, this is from just what I read, it takes approximately one full tree to be able to burn a human body. If they had burned as many witches as they say, Europe and Central and the western part of Asia would have been completely denuded of trees.
That's right. So carbon footprint would have been an earlier issue. You know, one of the things that struck me in starting with going through these various battles was the understanding of the use of mercenaries on not only on the Christian side, but on the Turk side. Why does that have an impact on the results of some of these battles and why they were fought the way they were? The idea of mercenaries, rather than, these are just the loyal people from this city who are defending themselves or fighting a war because they're Hungarians or they're Germans.
Well, the one problem in a pre-industrial society is that you need human labor to keep it productive. One of the reasons the Turks were able to field such huge armies was because they weren't being productive. They were going out and seizing what other people produced.
Okay.
The European armies had to draw them from professionals because everyone else had to remain productive. You had to farm, you had to manufacture in order to keep the economy going. So compared to the total population, the number of people you could put in the military was relatively small. And in fact, legally, under the feudal system, you could only draw on citizen levies for, I think, for 40 days a year or something like that.
Right.
And if your feudal dues were paid, they couldn't call you up again, or they had to pay you.
Right, and it's also interesting in reading through history at different times, in a sense, even to find out that sometimes the mercenaries who were fighting for the Turks or for Islamic groups against Christians were Christians.
Yeah. Not as much with the Turks.
Right.
More with the Moors
Right.
in Spain, but yes, mostly they were renegades.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the only reason the Turks were finally able to take Constantinople in 1453 was because they had a renegade Hungarian artilleryman who knew how to make the latest guns.
Right, I saw that, and that was one of the things you talked about with the Turks, at least later on, the fact their superiority in artillery, and the fact, I think it was in Vienna where, because of the mud or whatever, that some of the advantage they normally would have wasn't there.
Yeah, actually that was quite a number of the battles because due to heavy rains or swamps or whatever, they couldn't get these gigantic artillery pieces to the battle.
Right. Well, that's what happened to Napoleon at Waterloo. The rain in the morning, too late to start the attack.
Yes, as a number of battles, he wasn't able to turn around. He was at Austerlitz. He said he lost the battle in the morning and won it in the afternoon.
One in the afternoon, right, exactly. Well,
but the Turks managed to maintain artillery superiority for about 200 years, and then the West caught up with them.
Right. Now, you talk about an early spring of 1520, Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, so that's a name that most people have heard, was faced with a mutiny of his janissaries. What's a janissary?
A slave soldier.
Okay.
They were baptized Christians taken as slaves and put into the army. They were forbidden to marry, and presumably this ensured their absolute total loyalty to the Sultan. Mm-hmm. But it also ensured their absolute total loyalty to themselves if they didn't get enough loot.
Right.
So the Sultan had to have constant conquests and campaigns to keep them happy.
Well, I thought this was interesting, and this was under the section, was it Mohawks? How was that?
I think it's pronounced Mohawks.
Mohawks. Almost sounds like Indians or an old shopping center in New York called Mohawks.
That's what I was making think of.
The Janissary revolt probably hastened Suleiman's decision to march into Hungary, but it was clear that he had marked the country down for conquest sometime before. A further incentive was provided, I thought this was interesting, by the fact that the Emperor Charles V had captured the King Francis I of France at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. Imprisoned in Madrid, Francis opened up secret communications with Suleiman. The French king pleaded with the Sultan to attack Charles.
Yeah. This was happening all the time with France. Mm-hmm. France's goal was to be the #1 power in Europe. So, of course, they had to keep undermining the Holy Roman Empire, which was at that time the other contender for #1 power, along with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It has been suggested that the fact that Richelieu funded Gustavus Adolphus kept the 30 Years' War going and ensured the success of the Protestant Reformation, simply in order to keep France top dog.
Right. See, that's the part I think you bring out in here, in understanding. I think a lot of us, even who study history, have a much more of a kind of, let's say, World War I on kind of understanding of Europe and how it's associated, but realizing how many little countries were made up, and little areas that existed for years, even with the German Republic before, being brought together. You also talk about a further provision placed in the 10th part of the entire population of Hungary. I didn't realize this, male and female, at the disposal of the Sultan every 10 years. This meant that Suleiman could, as he wished, select up 10% of Hungarian people to enslave and deport to auction blocks and harems of Istanbul.
Yeah. This also ensured that he had enough janissaries to carry on the next campaign.
Right.
You could take the young boys, put them into the army, and you take the girls and sell them into the harems.
Now, obviously he showed up late for breakfast, and that was a problem for him. Why?
Because he had vowed that he would eat his breakfast in the ruins of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna in 1529. Unfortunately, the Viennese had a different idea. Mm-hmm. And so, after he had been failing in his assaults for about a week or so, he had made the vow that he would do it before the Feast of St. Michael on September the 29th. This was before, of course, it was the Feast of all the Archangels, and St. Michael being the special patron. Mm-hmm.
'They... 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 'They...
perhaps wisely or unwisely, depending on your point of view, decided to taunt him with it and sent him a special messenger saying that, excuse me, your magnificence, but your breakfast is growing cold. Would you be satisfied with what we can supply you that is hot from our cannons on the walls?
Right, okay. So it's good to keep a sense of humor in the midst of battle.
Well, when you're outnumbered about 10 or 15 to 1, it's a good idea.
Right. Well, that's the thing you see in almost most of these things, is that most of the time the Christian forces are heavily outnumbered, and in some cases they actually end up, obviously, in the case of like a Malta holding on, or a Vienna, or a Lepanto, end up winning. Now, as Catholics, certainly with Lepanto, we like to think in terms of Our Lady's help in these things, but obviously there still had to be the forces there to fight the battle.
Yeah. Well, part of it was the fact that the European method of war was they wanted to preserve as much as possible because, well, for one thing, the person you're fighting today might be your ally
Yeah, I think that was a
tomorrow.
really good point you make in the book.
Yeah.
Getting that understanding that they're not looking for this kind of scorched earth policy that you might get from the other side.
Yeah. Whereas the Turkish goal was utter destruction so you could grab the loot. So that when you're taking a fortified position, the European method was to zigzag your trenches, you know, drawing closer and closer, but protecting your men all the time. The Turkish method was, let's just clear a way for the troops to come charging up. And that could cost tens of thousands of lives just to dig the trench.
Right.
Because obviously, if you're going straight toward the goal that you're trying to take, they could enfilade the trenches, meaning they can fire straight down it and kill anybody who's in the way.
Right. But when they're cannon fodder, it doesn't really matter.
No, they were slave soldiers, and most of the people, they called them engineers, but basically they're just people they grabbed and said, okay, now you're a soldier.
Yeah, later on, well, sappers, they would call these guys who did the thing, and then putting the bombs or whatever, explosions, because I know that they did that with blowing up some of the positions, right, to be able to create craters and ways to be able to gain entrance into the fortifications, right? Right. Now, Lepanto, you say here at the beginning of Lepanto, the modern cynic sneers and wonders what the fuss was all about. People of the 16th century, however, had no doubt at all about the importance of the Battle of Lepanto. Why would people sneer about Lepanto?
Well, who cares if these people just want to move into Europe? I mean, religion doesn't matter. Economics doesn't matter. The state's going to take care of everything. Who cares who's in charge as long as we get what we want?
Well, one of the things I thought was very interesting is that because Venice was involved, obviously, and you tell one story about, I think here it is, now that the tide of the battle was beginning to ebb and an enormous crowd of debtors, Jews, heretics, perverts, and thieves launched themselves over the sides of the galleys to wade ashore, begin a new life in the mountains of Albania, most of them as bandits because they were afraid that the Viennese wouldn't live up to their promise to let them go. Right?
And they probably wouldn't have.
Right.
The problem with maintaining sea power before you had, you know, internal combustion engines was you needed galley slaves.
Right.
And that meant that you needed people to row these galleys, and there weren't that many enough to go around. If you had hundreds of galleys, you needed the people to man them, which meant that you had to find enough people who, either slaves or criminals or anybody you could put in. At Lepanto, they were fortunate that some people actually volunteered to row. And one of the great things that Don Juan of Austria did was to promise all the galley slaves that if they fought, they were free. And they kept their promise, but they were afraid the Venetians weren't going to.
Do it, right, yeah.
Because since the Venetians did not like the short end of any bargain.
Right. You make that very clear here. Now, in the beginning you say, too, this book was dedicated to my mother who waited but did not live to see it.
Well, she died actually the same day as Leonard Nimoy. So even that got taken from her. So
she was a big Star Trek fan?
Well, actually, my first cousin once removed was producer of the original show.
Oh, okay.
So Gene Kuhn.
Gene, okay. Right,
he wrote one of the best episodes, of course.
Well, you do say so yourself. Did you ever try your hand at writing screenplays or anything?
No.
Okay.
I've written quite a few other things. I've written a couple of novels under pen names that you really don't want to read.
Okay.
But I seem to do best at writing history or on economic and social justice.
Now, a lot of this came out of articles you had previously put out, right?
Yeah.
And put
about
into this.
half of it did.
So do you prefer writing books, or are you writing, essays or articles?
Well, mostly for this book, it came out of about half of it came out of previously written articles, and then to fill in and give the whole a thematic structure, I wrote additional articles like the Siege of Necosia, which when I was writing the articles originally years ago, I didn't have enough information on it. There was hardly anything. I was lucky enough to find a first-hand account of the battle. There's practically nothing written about it in English.
Right.
Most everyone, Nicosia was the capital of Cyprus.
Right. You talk about that in the book.
Right? Most of the people who focus on Cyprus, that campaign, focus on Famagusta, because that was the big, long siege. And when the Turks violated the surrender that they had agreed to, that infuriated the Venetians at Lepanto. And it's credited with being at least part of the incentive for winning the battle.
Right. Okay, so 10 Battles Every Catholic Should Know, another book in the works?
Quite a few, actually, but on this subject, I'm working on a rather large project that I call How Christendom Became Catholic, which sounds odd because, well, from a strict standpoint, it's always been Catholic.
Absolutely.
But
we certainly say that here. Mother Angelica would believe that. So we'll have to take a look at that book when you decide to write it. It's great to have you here. Thank you. Talking to Michael D. Graney, author of 10 Battles Every Catholic Should Know, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com is the place to buy. Interesting. Check it out and join us next time right here on Bookmark. Thanks.